Hello, this is Chris, and this is a bonus episode of Chris's Billboard Top 3000 podcast, where I count down the top 3,000 songs in Billboard history in sets of 20 per episode. However, in this particular episode, I will not be counting down any songs, as this is another long-distance dedication. I've done one before. I'm doing one now, so I hope you enjoy. This dedication goes out to my friends, all of my friends, in particular the friends that I had in the spring of summer of 1987. That was the year that I rediscovered American Top 40 with Casey Kasem and attempted and failed to predict the 10 greatest songs of that year. I should probably set the stage for you. I grew up in Berwyn, Illinois, a suburb just outside of Chicago in the 80s, and I first listened to American Top 40 and Casey Kasem in the spring of 1982, as I mentioned in my previous long-distance dedication, and was a faithful listener in 82 and 83 and 84. But by the time 1985 and 1986 rolled around, I'd started to drift away a little bit from Casey Kasem. It wasn't like I wasn't interested in the pop charts or pop music or making my own countdowns, which I did faithfully in 83 and 84 and 86, my top 25 songs recorded into my cassette recorder at the time. I still actually have the one from 1986. If I'm ever adventurous enough to get that somehow digital from my old cassette tape, I'll actually play a little bit for you in a future podcast. I don't know, it might be cringeworthy for me, but faithfully listening to Casey Kasem's broadcasts on WLS AM Chicago every Sunday from 9 to 1 was not as much of a thing as it was in my early childhood years in 82 through 84. I had additional interest beyond music and pop music. I was just as much of a sports fan as I was a music fan, and growing up near Chicago in the 80s was a pretty good time to be a fan. In 1983, the Chicago White Sox baseball team won the division. It was the first time that a baseball team from Chicago went to the playoffs since 1959, so that was kind of a big deal. And then, of course, 1984, when the Chicago Cubs won the division, my favorite team, and that year's team cemented me as a fan for life. That was the Harry Carey years and Ryne Sandberg and Rick Sutcliffe. There's some really good memories there. And then, of course, the coup de grace in 1985, the Chicago Bears football team won the Super Bowl, their only Super Bowl win in the 60 years of the Super Bowl era. I still watched MTV a lot, and I still recorded songs on my cassette player, as I was mentioning that I had one in the mid-'80s. It was so much nicer to have cassettes than albums because you can carry them around everywhere. Record players were a little less portable back then, but actually listening to American Top 40 became more and more distant. I still paid attention, and particularly to the year-end countdowns. I do remember listening to the 1986 Top 100 all in one sitting in my kitchen. I think it was 8 hours long. That's when That's What Friends Are For was the number one song of that year. But the weekly Top 40, well, that eluded me a bit. What I really loved to do most in my childhood to adolescent years was hang out with my friends. I remember my best friend Cliff Franco in 3rd and 4th grade, but then he moved away. And then my best friend Dave Heeman in 5th and 6th grade, we hung out all the time. I remember in the summer of 84, lounging around the parking lot at the nearby McDonald's, picking up those scratch-off tickets for events where if they won the event, then you got a free Big Mac. And we got so many free Big Macs that summer because Russia boycotted the Olympics, so they had an enormous amount of gold medals, of which we had enormous amount of scratch-off tickets. I ate a lot of Big Macs that summer. Unfortunately, he moved away after 6th grade, into Arizona too. I only saw him a couple of times after that. Broke my heart. In 7th grade, I met Dave Mahala, another best friend of mine, and we went to the Berwyn Rec to go swimming that summer of 1985, almost every frickin' day. Played lots of wiffle ball, played lots of Stratomatic baseball, and then after 8th grade in 86, he moved away. He was beginning to think it was me. But in 86, I started high school at Morton West High School, also in Berwyn, and went out for the track team. And I met a really, really great group of friends, so many of them that they couldn't possibly all move away, correct? But it was more than just guy friends. There were girls, because you remember when you turn 14, everything is about hormones and crushes on girls and asking girls on dates and making out with girls. And I didn't really make out with many girls because I was way too shy, even though you can hear me talking all the time. And I really didn't shut up back then either, but then I was too shy to actually ask a girl out on a date, although a lot of my friends asked girls out on dates. And I was friends with a lot of those girls, but none of them wanted to kiss me. So much drama back then. But we called ourselves the Sun Bums. There's about 15 of us total from the track team and from various parts within the high school, and we rode our bikes everywhere. We played sand volleyball. You remember these years, the high school years. Didn't have a care in the world. You didn't have to worry about jobs. You didn't have to worry about money. You didn't have to worry about life's pressures as an adult. You can just ride your bike and be free with all of the music that was out there, the top 40 music, the pop music that you had on the radio. Back then it was a lot of Madonna, a lot of Phil Collins, a lot of Robert Palmer, and those songs were my adolescent anthem in 1986, 1987, and so on and so forth. And we would stay at people's houses and watch A Nightmare on Elm Street and Revenge of the Nerds. They say that friends come in and out of your life like internet fads, and it was true, especially for me back then. But this wonderful group of friends, the Andres, the Mikes, the Shawns, the Joes, and girls too, the Karens and the Cindys. And Cindy Jacobs, I had such a wonderful crush on her. Never kissed her though. It was always unrequited. Such a sweet person though, and we were friends for a long time after that. I'm sure many listeners have very similar stories, although the names might be different, the locations might be different, but that feeling of free, that push from childhood to adulthood through the wonderful gateway of adolescence. The date that I reacquainted myself with Casey Kasem was February 1st, 1987. I was still a freshman in high school and sitting in my bedroom, bored out of my mind. And it was a Sunday, and I got to thinking, I hadn't listened to Casey Kasem in a long time. I wonder if he's still on. And he was still on between 9 and 1, although it was close to 1 o'clock. I didn't have the same shackles of going to church that I did as a child, so I had a little bit more freedom. So I turned it on, and it was just getting to the top 2 songs of that particular week. Some of the same feelings that I had in the March of 82 transferred over to February 1st, 1987, and it manifested itself right in that very first song, the number 2 song, Open Your Heart by Madonna. I wasn't a huge Madonna fan, but that was, and to this day is, my favorite song by her, and it was zooming up the charts, ready to hit number 1, but not quite number 1 that week. Number 1 that week was an old song from 1981, a number 79 hit back in 1981. When it was originally released, and then it went away for a long time, and then became the feature song in the sitcom Family Ties, when Michael J. Fox had that slow dance with his girlfriend Ellen, played by Tracy Pollan, who incidentally married Michael J. Fox, and they are still married to this day. The song was called At This Moment by Billy Vera and the Beaters, and it was so good because I saw that episode where they were dancing together, and it filled up my heart, and it was number 1 for the second straight week upon its re-release in February of 87. And now I said, I've got to listen to this every week, but not just listen to the top 40. So glad to be back in it. So glad to be hearing the wonderful voice of Casey Kasem again. But I am going to figure out what the top songs of that year are. I'm going to listen to it every week, and then I'm going to predict what will be the number 1 song of the year. I know that is a passion of the listeners to this podcast because I get messages from several of you saying, this particular song, what was its final rank? I know it had to be ranked sort of high because it peaked at number 6 or peaked at number 3. Did it actually make the top 3,000? I bet you this one made it. I bet you this one didn't, because we are all little predictors in our lives when it comes to pop music. So I know this resonates with some people, and I'm sure many of you did the same thing when you were listening to your charts in whatever year you were listening to them. But I had never written them down back in 82 and 83. Well, I did in 87, and I did for the rest of the year from February all the way to December, wrote down every single top 40 And I kept those notebooks too, my adolescent talismans, as it were. I did notice there were quite a few changes from me listening to the charts as a 9-year-old in 1982 and listening to them as a 14-year-old in 1987. One, the songs from the early 80s seemed to be at the number one position for a lot longer than the songs in the late 80s. Back in 82, songs would frequently hit number one for 6 weeks, Eye of the Tiger, or 7 weeks, I Love Rock and Roll, or 8 weeks, Every Breath You Take, or 9 weeks, Betty Davis Eyes, or even 10 weeks, like Physical. All of those songs hit number one between 1981 and 1983, but that didn't happen after that time period. In fact, after the 6-week run by Madonna's Like a Virgin at the end of 84, beginning of 85, no song hit number one for longer than 4 weeks until 1991. Can you believe that? That actually was a little bit distressing for me because that was my baseline. It was what I was used to. I kept waiting for a song to stay longer than a week, 2 weeks, maybe even 3, and a couple at 4, but no more than 4. It didn't feel right. But despite that difference, it didn't really matter to me a whole lot. I was having fun again. I was having fun again in a way that I didn't since 1982. You can even be nostalgic at 14 for times when you were just a tad younger, and I was enjoying that moment. Not just the moment of listening to the charts, but listening to the charts and sharing it with my friends. All the friends that I had mentioned on the track team, all the ones that we played sand volleyball with, all the ones that we rode around in our bikes and watched Nightmare on Elm Street and Revenge of the Nerds. I got to tell them about the charts. I got to tell them about my love of ranking music, and most of them would humor me and play along with it. Some of them thought I was crazy because I'm a chart nut. But the Aretha Franklin and George Michael hits, the Whitney Houston hits, the Bangles, the Crowded Houses hit, Don't Dream It's Over, that all percolated throughout the spring of 1987 and into the summer of 1987. The one song that was my favorite from 1987 was George Michael's solo hit, I Want Your Sex. You know, that one that was banned in a lot of radio stations from playing because it said the word sex in it explicitly. So tame now, but it was banned so much that it kept it out of the number one spot. Had it been played on all the stations at the time it was at its peak popularity, it would have been number one, but it stalled at number two. Instead, U2's I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For beat it out. But that song I always played. It was the first song that I played when I took a shower, and I was usually out of the shower before that song was finished because I wanted to go hang out with my friends. God, I loved the summer of 1987. Maybe my favorite summer of my entire childhood and adolescence. And that's when I heard the news that we were moving. I heard it in June of 87 that we were moving to Batavia, a town about 35 miles west of Chicago, about 25 miles west of where I was living right now. Didn't know a single person, except my family, of course. And I'd just gotten braces. Not those nice invisible plastic ones you see now, but full-blown metal. Yeah, I was hitting 15 years old. I had a great group of friends that I knew all of them couldn't move away, and then I did. I remember the first day at lunch at my new school. The math teacher sat with me for some company because I didn't have anybody else. Except my brother, of course, my twin brother. But we didn't have the same lunch period. Oh my. I did meet some friends, some good friends, some friends that have lasted a long, long time, and that's later in the story. But in 1987, I kind of needed American Top 40 and Casey Kasem and that familiar voice that was moving with me. I was still writing everything down, trying to predict what was going to be the number one song of the year, possibly Alone by Heart that had a 3-week run, or maybe it was Living on a Prayer back in February and March that had that big 4-week run. I thought that was going to be the number one song of the year. It was kind of the one that I was rooting for in much the same way I was rooting for I Love Rock and Roll back in 1982, because that was a rocking hit. It burst Bon Jovi into superstardom. They already had a number one hit before, but this was their big one. This was their magnum opus very early in their careers. And despite it was only a 4-week run, again, they didn't last that long up there. You see, there was a lot of turnover in the top 10. In fact, there were more songs on this Billboard Top 3000 countdown from 1987 than any other year in the rock era. Interesting factoid. In 1982, the year that I'm using as the comparison, there were 225 songs that made the top 40. In 87, it was only 217, a difference of 8. However, there were 72 songs that made the top 5 in 1987. In 82, only 43. Again, lots of turnover at the top, which leads to a high concentration of stuff in the top 3,000. Thought you might like to know. Of course, I didn't know that when it was happening live. I remember the day we moved, August 19th, 1987. Yes, I remember the date. I'm that weird. The number one song was Who's That Girl by Madonna, followed by a 3-week run by La Bamba, by Los Lobos off the La Bamba soundtrack. And I remember listening to that top 40, and our house was so brand new, we didn't have carpet in our room, listening to that first week of their 3-week run. That was also the fall of Dirty Dancing coming out, when Bill Medley and Jennifer Warren's number one hit, I'd Had the Time of My Life. Ironically, Jennifer Warren's also had a duet that ended 1982 off of a soundtrack, that one with Joe Cocker, Up Where We Belong, from the An Officer and a Gentleman soundtrack. Coincidence? Perhaps. But that was the last song before Casey Kasem was going to have his top 100 of 1987, and boy was I prepared for this. I basically shut off the world and spent the next 8 hours glued to my radio and my cassette player where I can record the songs that I liked, even though that had Casey Kasem's intro. And I know that bugs the heck out of anyone who wants to record onto a cassette from the radio that you have to listen to the DJ's voice for the entire intro until the song starts playing. Tell me I'm not the only one that feels this way. But that top 100 began, and it began with song number 100, Love You Down, by Ready for the World. Remember this song? By the group that's from Michigan but looked like they were from England based on the outfits that they were wearing. They had that number one song, Oh Sheila, but this was their follow-up hit. It wasn't very good, but I knew it. I knew I tracked it, and I was actually surprised it hit number 100. And then we got to 99, and it was Pseudo Echo. Remember that band from Australia? The one that was so happy to be in the United States that they remade a song, Funky Town, from 1980, and they were even wearing California Angels baseball shirts while they were playing the video, and they never had another top 40 hit again. That was 99, Funky Town. One of the things that I had fun doing was the songs before the move and the songs after the move. Anything before August was a Berwyn song. Anything after August was a Batavia song. But they intermingled throughout that top 100, and that was a lot of fun. Yes, us chart geeks can be real geeks, can't we? And throughout the next 6.5 hours, despite all those frickin' commercials, I was in heaven. It was bliss. It felt good again to be with my old friend Casey Kasem and the top 100 songs, especially because I was prepared for it. And most of the songs I knew, a few I didn't. They were from before the February period, because remember, I started in February 1st, so there was that whole January period. But I figured it was only a couple of songs. Foreshadowing. I get to the top 20 and the top 15, and song number 11 was Los Lobos and the theme song from La Bamba, La Bamba. And that surprised me because that was 3 weeks number one, and there weren't that many songs 3 weeks at number one, but it hit number 11, and I checked it off my list. What surprised me more, though, was song number 10, Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi. Wait a minute. They were number one for 4 weeks. There was no other song in the entire year that was number one for 4 weeks, and this one wasn't. It was number 10? Did I do something wrong? That felt so out of place. I know I Love Rock and Roll by Joan Jett back in 82 was 7 weeks number one, and that only hit number 4, but the 3 songs that were above it were worthy of being above it. 6 weeks number one, Centerfold. 6 weeks number one, Eye of the Tiger. 10 weeks number one, Physical. No matter. I checked it off my list and kept going. Number 9 was Shakedown by Bob Seger. God, I love Bob Seger. It only hit number 1 for 1 week, but it was also off a soundtrack, Beverly Hills Cop 2. A lot of soundtracks in the 80s. And I get to song number 8, and I learned my key second lesson about American Top 40. The first one was that songs didn't stay at number one as long as they did in the early 80s. The second one is the chart period for a year goes from December of the previous year to November of this year. They do that so they could have the top 100 in time for Christmas, and that's understandable. But I had totally forgotten about that back in February, which meant there were 2 months that I had omitted when I was tracking the 1987 hits. Both January and December of 86, I had a blind spot. And an additive to that rule is most of the songs from December tended to stay longer than the ones for the rest of the year. It's not a surprise that the number one song of 1988 actually hit number one in 1987, and the number one song from 1989 actually hit number one in 1988, and those aren't the only 2 years where that happened. The song number 8 was Bruce Hornsby and the Range is the Way It Is. Now, I love that song. Bruce Hornsby became my favorite late 80s band, as most of you know from my previous podcasts. Daryl Hall and John Oates was my favorite, but they didn't put out any music in 1987, so I found Bruce Hornsby and his wonderful piano to be just as enticing. And I had the Way It Is cassette. I played that one to death, but the fact that it was in 87 surprised me, because it hit number one in 1986. Again, just for 1 week, but it had enough points to pass up Living on a Prayer. So the countdown keeps going. Number 7, Here I Go Again by Whitesnake. That was a Batavia song. 6 was C'est La Vie by Robbie Neville, and it came from December of 86 again. And I never frickin' heard that song before this particular countdown. I felt like such a total loser, and it didn't even hit number 1. Number 5 was Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now by Starship. I remember that one. And number 4 was Whitney Houston's hit, I Want to Dance with Somebody Who Loves Me, who hit number 1 right on the 4th of July. I did have those marked down. Number 3 was Gregory Abbott's Shake You Down, another song I had never heard of before that countdown, and it was number 3. My goodness, I felt like I failed somehow, like Christopher Reeve did as Superman in Superman 2 when he turns mortal, but then he realizes he screwed up because Nan and Ursa and Zod were wrecking havoc on the Earth, and he says he has to go back, and he goes back without a winter coat and gloves, by the way. That was stupid. But he gets to the North Pole, and he's in this fortress of solitude all by himself, and it's so dark, and he said, "Father, I've failed." That was me right about the time Shake You Down was playing in the top 100. They get to song number 2, Alone by Heart, a summer song. That hits number 1 for 3 weeks, so I could see that being one of the biggest hits of the year, and then it hit number 1. Another 1986 song. The number 1 song of 87 actually hit number 1 in 1986. Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles. Also 4 weeks number 1, something else that I didn't know. But man, that blind spot turned out to cause quite a little bit of a car crash for somebody who's been feverishly paying attention to every single week for 10 and a half months. So the show ends with my C-plus grade paper for trying to predict the top 10, and was more determined the next year, 1988. To be better than 1987, I learned my lesson, and for 52 consecutive weeks, I wrote down every single top 40 hit from 1987 and did a much better job in 1988, I have to say. Although Casey Kasem wasn't around anymore, he had actually left American Top 40 in the summer of '88, replaced by worthwhile but not quite the same Shadoe Stevens. Life was changing, not just for me. It did feel like the loss of a friend a bit, a lot like the friends that I had in Berwyn in 1987. I made some good friends in my new town of Batavia, John and Aaron and Dan and Mike and Ralph. I even had my first girlfriend, Tanya, had my first kiss in 1988, played to the song Candle in the Wind by Elton John. I remember that dance, which I've already reviewed in my countdown. I didn't really listen to American Top 40 in 1989. I was kind of burnt out on it. Way too much New Kids on the Block. And I was getting into my own music, becoming a college student after 1990 and being much more avant-garde. about the music that I listened to. I was into Tori Amos, if that gives you any indication as to my musical tastes at that point. I started making my own top hundreds and top 200s and top 500s, and that sort of replaced the pop charts. The friends that I had moved away from in Berwyn kind of scattered to the four winds, although a lot of them still are in good contact with each other, still best friends with each other, and through social media we still talk. Some of them are even members of this Facebook podcast community. But time, just like the Billboard charts, keeps on marching on, marching on. One final footnote. I'm recording this on September 23rd, 2025. It is my 53rd birthday. I've never shied away from birthdays. I always feel like the alternative to that is not hitting your birthday, and I'd rather have birthdays than not have them. About 3 years ago, just before I turned 50, my first real crush, Cindy Jacobs, the one I mentioned earlier from Berwyn, one of the Sunbums, one of my good friends that I was totally in love with as a freshman in high school could be in love with. She passed away from cancer. I had talked to her a lot. I did see her in those final couple of days. She was a truly special person and will definitely be missed. And it is a sign that time does move on. But the memories, oh God, the memories, they stay, don't they? That wonderful summer of 1987 with I Want Your Sex and watching Top Gun and Nightmare on Elm Street and all those bikes and all that wonderful music. That wonderful time where I was determined to predict the top 100 songs of 1987, and all of my wonderful friends, including my wonderful friend Casey Kasem, who never knew me, but man, did I know him. I dedicate this podcast to the memory of my friends from 1987. And also to perhaps my best friend, my brother Jason. We share a birthday. We both turned 53 today. He's the one friend that's been around the entire time. I say that about my sisters too, Jennifer and Elizabeth. But my brother, my twin brother, was in that Sunbums group. He was the one listening. He was the U2 fan. He was the one that was grateful that I still hadn't found what I'm looking for. Beat out I Want Your Sex in August of 1987 for the number one position. I dedicate this episode to him and my sisters and my family and my friends, the old ones from 87 and the new ones that I have made ever since. And even the newest friends, a lot of them listeners on this podcast. I appreciate all of you. And thank you for listening to my long-distance dedication. We will get back to regular scheduled episodes. I just wanted to tell this story in the interim. It is one of the great pleasures in life, truly, to connect with people, with voice or with song. I hope I've done both. And so on, and so on, and Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Good day.